Hey, everybody. Welcome to From Our Perspective. We are two therapists who are moms with a mic. My name is Katie Truax.
And I'm Claudia Glassman.
And we have been friends for, I think we were just talking, it's either 12 or 13 years, but it's been quite a while.
Yes.
And we met in a professional setting back in Atlanta where we shared space at the same office. On East Shadow Lawn, a long time ago, many years ago.
That's right. And then we were pregnant at the same time.
Yes. And you gave birth a month before I did, about 3 times as fast as I did.
Yeah.
And our girls are still good friends, even though we're now divided by states. So I'm currently practicing as a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, and this will be my 15th year of clinical practice.
And I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have to do math. Since 2004. That's when I started.
Oh.
Yeah. So 16, 17, 18. Oh, wow. It's been a minute.
Years this year.
Yeah. Wow.
And we're starting a podcast.
And we are starting a podcast. And so, yes, I'm excited about this because we have a lot of conversations that I feel like are awesome. And I thought we should share them because I think it's fun. First of all, I want people to hear that your therapist is human too, right? But I do think that we have insight and information we can provide for people and kind of give them insight and tools. But we're also navigating life ourselves, and we're part of this like human experience too. And so I don't know. I hope everyone realizes that therapists are human and we're just as, struggle and have highs and lows and curse and, do all the things that normal people do. Even though you don't
curse.
Oh,
I'm just kidding.
I can't even pretend. It might come out here. I don't know.
I know. I think it should.
I may have to change our rating from clean to explicit. I mean, I don't know.
Oh yeah, maybe in time we'll just evolve.
We'll become more explicit. So yeah. So today we're going to talk about a loaded topic, anxiety. Yeah. Anxiety.
Because everybody's talking about it, right? Like that's like the buzzword.
Yes. And you had pointed out before we got on here, just like we could do about 1 million episodes on anxiety alone. I don't disagree. So we're going to focus today on kind of that anxiety you have around parenting.
Okay.
We all have around parenting.
Yes.
So I remember I was a super chill, laid back parent until I became a parent. And then everything, like you have to keep this human alive. And just that alone is anxiety provoking. Like they send you home from the hospital and you put your kid in the car seat, right? And then they're like, bye. And I'm thinking, really?
Okay.
That's it. That's all the help I get,
Right.
And it kind of starts, I mean, I guess pregnancy was anxiety provoking too, but it started there. Like, what was your experience kind of with that kicking
anxiety? Oh, yeah. I remember, I don't know when it started, like what age Ellie was, but I do remember really acutely laying awake at night and playing out different scenarios in my mind about like bad things that could happen and how we would survive them, like how to get out of them. Like, God forbid if somebody were to ever like break in the house or, fill in the blank, right? Yada, yada, yada. Like what would we do to get safe again?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think, do you think like we should talk a little bit about kind of our perspective on what anxiety is before we go too much further?
Let's go there. Yeah.
Okay. And we probably define it differently, which is I think even cooler because, as two different clinicians and two different humans who've been doing these roles for a long time now and on the planet for a little while, we have different perspectives, right? And so some of our listeners might resonate with a little bit of everything and some might take more from your perspective than from mine or vice versa. But for me, like whenever I talk with a client about anxiety, I kind of try to explain that the brain is designed first and foremost to keep us alive before anything else. And once we become parents, its job expands to not only keep our bodies alive, but to keep our bodies and those of our little children alive as well. And so the brain, with that as its primary task, is always going to be on the lookout for things that could be a threat to life or limb. And that's not problematic, nor is it indicative of psychological distress or dysfunction, but it's adaptive and it's normal. We'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, maybe a different day, but it can get out of hand, and that's where we have it become problematic, right? Or we can have anxiety in response to things that are not threatening, right? So if anxiety becomes too big or comes around at the wrong time or comes in response to things that aren't inherently problematic for us, that's kind of what I talk about as being kind of maladaptive versus adaptive anxiety. But the anxiety itself is not a bad thing. It's just a descriptor for a series of physiological events that happen in the body when the brain says, uh-oh, we got a problem. And then the body starts mounting its defenses and its readiness to fight or to run from that problem.
Yeah. And I don't
How would
think,
you add? Mhm.
yeah, I actually share that viewpoint with you. I think without anxiety, and I tell my clients this all the time, because anxiety's gotten such a reputation
Yeah.
of something to be eliminated. And my
Mhm.
argument is if we eliminate it completely, we start doing dumb stuff like running out in
Right.
front of cars because we don't think about it. And I also like to tell my clients that there's a spectrum of anxiety,
Mhm.
right? You've got those that have lower levels, and those are kind of like, I was going to like your adrenaline junkies, right? Like people
Mhm.
that can do things that I won't do because my self-preservation kicks in. But for them, it takes more to kind of get that rise, right? And then you have the other side of the spectrum where anxiety is so debilitating, people can't function, right? They're not leaving their houses for fear of, the world and whatnot.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then you've got
Yeah.
everyone else floating in the middle. But that it's a function, it's functional, right? And it's not something I think that we need to eliminate. I think that feeling of anxiety is a signal to us that we need to address something,
Mhm.
right? And I think we spend a lot of time trying to squash the anxiety and not as much time kind of sitting with it and listening to it and then kind of working with it versus trying to just make it disappear.
Yeah.
Because it is, useful,
Mhm.
right? I also think as humans, we experience anxiety differently than animals. Like animals experience anxiety based on a threat in the moment, and then they kind of shake it off and go about. They don't store that memory for a future threat necessarily, right? They don't walk around with this fear response of like, what if I see a fox? What if I see a fox? I'm not going out to get my nuts, right? They just
Mhm.
go and get their nuts, otherwise they wouldn't survive. Because our brains function differently, we start storing things in memory banks.
Mhm.
And then we start responding to memories. Sometimes it's news stories. I mean, you can, hear news stories and hear
Right.
about an event, and that gets into your mind to the point where now you're like, well, I have to avoid that too. That is a danger I didn't know existed.
Yes.
And now it is,
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's more about managing and then recognizing, to your point, when is it impacting my life?
Yeah. So like as new moms, right? Going back to your question, right? The anxiety was normal and natural because one, we had to stay alive. Like even it was more important for us to stay alive because we had a life depending on us.
Yeah.
And then two, we had to keep these new little tiny things alive too.
Yes.
And I don't know, I will say, when you were mentioning some people are lower on anxiety, and gave the example of the adrenaline junkie. That's a great example. That also comes in another flavor, which is the flavor of my husband, who like is just like the most cool, calm, and collected cucumber that could ever exist. So that's a beautiful type of partner to have in many, many occasions. And when you were awake at 3 a.m. trying to figure out how to get into your baby's room and get him or her out should the smoke detector start going, on and he's sleeping soundly beside you, that's a recipe for like mama's anxiety to ramp up even more because it's kind of like, okay, well, I'm alone in this. So I've got to be like mama bear, right? Like it's all on my shoulders, right? Which is a whole other phenomenon we'll maybe talk about at another time. But it's interesting to note kind of how that anxiety can be kind of like played into by your surroundings too. Not only what you experience, but then how other people around you are reacting for better or for worse can turn your dial up or down too.
Yes. Yeah. And I also was really aware, which I don't think I was prepared for because no one tells you this when you become a parent, but this like existential anxiety that
Mm,
came up for me that was, I don't think I ever thought about my own mortality
uh-huh.
really until I had kids and was like, oh, if something happens to me, what happens to those little people?
Yeah.
And that was something I wasn't prepared for because it was just you. I guess it doesn't matter, right? And then
Right.
you're responsible for these people. And when, they're, especially when they're babies, like their survival is based on my ability to take care of them, to
Mhm,
feed them, to
mhm.
nurse them, and it became, a thought that pops up every now and then. I'd go on date nights with Adam and I'd be like, what if we don't come back?
Right.
Like, never in my life have I thought that, and,
Mhm.
I talk to clients a lot about anxiety. I work a lot with, moms specifically, but dads too. And this idea that, like, yeah, they're like, my thoughts get crazy sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I can get some dark thoughts too. Like, that's a morbid thought. Why would I think that? We're going to enjoy a lovely dinner and I'm worried about not coming home.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
the way I explain it is like, I let the thought come in and then I'm like, thank you, brain, for that
Mhm.
concern. And then I just do my thing, right? It doesn't stop me from doing those things, but the thoughts definitely pop into my mind. I just don't let them stay there. I don't,
Mhm.
let them simmer for long. I just kind of was like, okay. And then I go do my thing, but those are the things I wasn't prepared for.
Yeah, the thoughts popping in.
And that's the anxiety I struggle with more than, other parents I know where it's like, oh my God, my kid's sick and they're freaking out about the cold and they're running to the doctor because that's where their anxiety manifests.
Right.
Mine is less there, but it's more in that more like existential areas where my anxiety sits. Um, I think it does manifest differently. Yours was like, how do I keep these people safe?
Right.
And
Well,
so it manifests differently.
and to your point about like our life experiences, right? Like, so full disclosure, so prior to having Ellie, I was primarily a trauma therapist and worked under a grant from the government for people providing free counseling services to people who'd been through crime. So all day, every day, I was hearing stories of crime, and it could be any type of crime, and I won't really share too much more here because that's not the purpose here, and I don't want to upset anyone. But one might imagine, right, some of the stories that I've heard, and like Claudia said, when you watch news, oh, that's a new thing to be afraid of. Well, as a therapist too, particularly a therapist for crime victims or trauma survivors, right, we're hearing stories of things that, oh wow, that's a unique type of awful that I didn't imagine before I sat down in my office today to do this job. And then we then therefore have to incorporate that into our awareness of the things that could happen in this world, right, to us or to the people that we love. And balancing that awareness, with enough wherewithal to still be able to enjoy life can be hard, right? um, so when I'm laying in bed, worrying about, okay, what happens if my house catches fire, or somebody breaks in, right? And other moms might be worried about, oh, is that fever too high, or so
Yeah.
forth or so on. We all kind of come to the table with something a little bit different as our own histories and stories and backgrounds. You and I probably had less healthcare anxiety because we, prior to becoming moms, were kind of pretty steeped in natural healthcare. Claudia, you and I both, like,
Mhm.
your sister-in-law is a natural healthcare provider, and you've been doing lots of beautiful natural healthcare for you and for your entire family for years and years and years and years. I'm married to a functional wellness doctor, so we kind of like maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with things regarding like the physical body,
Yeah.
perhaps,
Yeah.
and how all that works, which is interesting because sometimes that knowledge can really be an antidote for anxiety as well, kind of understanding what's going on.
Yes. Right. But that also is an anxiety for some people that didn't have, that maybe their first birth experience was a challenge, and entering the second birth experience created, some anxiety. And honestly, the mortality rates for mothers in this country is not as low as I feel like it should be, right? For birthing mamas. And so that is not necessarily out of nowhere, the fear around that. And so I think, yeah, it all comes down to, and this is kind of something I want to hone in on, as a point that you made up, when you're doing your trauma work and you're hearing just this repeat of someone's trauma and crimes and horrible events, you really have to work to create balance so that that doesn't become your only worldview,
Mhm.
right? Because all of a sudden you're going to think the world is the scariest, most dangerous place, because that's the information you're getting,
Right.
So before we kind of maybe jump into strategies that we found to kind of manage this,
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on when does it become problematic? When do people need more support? When is it manageable on their own? And maybe it's a combination of, it is manageable on your own until it isn't, right?
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that? Like, what would you tell people of what do you look for when you're like, maybe you need some extra support?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I feel like there's so many different ways to answer that question. Well, one, if it starts to impact your physical health,
Yes.
so things like sleep, digestion, muscle tension in the body, pain, if it starts to impact relationships, right? If you find yourself irritable or angry, kind of always on edge, whether it's with your children, your husband, your friends, like you said, interfering in your ability or willingness to like engage normally, right? You don't want to go out anymore. You don't want to go to the grocery store. You don't want to go out dinner with your husband because what happens if we don't come back, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that can be tricky too, is teasing out what's an appropriate fear and when are we being careful and safe and wise versus when are we being ruled by fear, right? In a way that's not adaptive. Um, and then, I think that there's also room for like just individuals to elect, like, I want to feel better, right? Like, I do think that there's such thing as kind of like living in Zen, I mean, maybe you have to be a Buddhist monk on a mountaintop somewhere by yourself to get there, but like, I think we can try to like approximate that. I think it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of awareness and a lot of skill and a lot of time spent to create a state of calm and peacefulness and joy that is our normal. But I think that it can be a goal. I actually started a new client yesterday and she was coming in to work on anxiety. And she really described, she was very self aware. She knew exactly what was going on. She already had a beautiful repertoire of skills under her belt. And, at the end of our time, I kind of reflected that back to her and she said, "Yeah, thank you. And yet I kind of want to fine tune it, right? I want to get even better. I want to get it even more manageable so it affects me, less and less." And it probably is the case that I'll find out more about her situation in time, as usually is, she'll probably share more and more the longer we're together about how it's impacting her, right? More than she did in just the first session. But so I think that there's room for people to say, all right, it's okay. It's not necessarily causing me a lot of harm, but like I want it to feel better.
Yes. And I think that's a good point, right? We don't have to always be in that crisis and so debilitated by it to want to address it, to say, maybe I just want to process it with someone. I just want someone to be a sounding board, or
Mhm.
to give me even more skills, right? Or there's certain, blocks I have. I just can't seem to manage it in this area, right? And I would also add, kind of just really looking at, and this might be a longer topic for another day, but the way that our anxiety as parents can impact our children.
Oh my gosh, totally. Yeah,
Because
that's a good one. That's
when
so
it starts
good.
to bleed into your child's life, like, you're
Yes.
not letting them play outside for fear of something happening. You're
Right.
not, right? Like your anxiety is starting to impact their health and well-being. And
Mhm.
as your child gets older, you really start to see the way they mimic your worry, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I would also say,
That-
from that perspective, I think there's a genetic component to anxiety, but I think there's also a lot of environmental. We learn what's scary and dangerous by following our parents around what's scary and dangerous. But if everything is scary and dangerous to our parents, then everything's scary and dangerous to us too, right? So I would just add also, like, when you start to notice it's really impacting your parenting, you're having difficulty allowing your child reasonable freedoms to do things out of fear that there's a negative outcome, right?
Yeah.
For me, the number one way I manage this is I am on a news diet. Like
Okay.
I don't
Confusing.
consume it. I don't
Okay.
consume it um,
Me neither.
because
I
I
wish we had
know.
like listeners who could like raise their hands and like tell us like how many people that seems like so weird, right?
Yeah,
Because
well,
there's so many people listening and saying like, "Oh my God, like that's so strange," or "Well, how do you know if something bad's happening?" or "How do you stay up with what's happening in the world?" or
mhm.
"That's so like irresponsible of you socially or politically or humanitarianly." Is that a word? I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't know. Do you feel like you're out of? I don't. I feel like it still finds me because things still, like, I interact with people, right? I mean, I still get news. I just don't get the clickbaity headlines.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, I was looking. There was a peanut butter recall, and I was like, "Is it my peanut butter? I don't
Right.
know." And then I looked for that, and then it was like, I actually took a long time to find that, but I found all these other things. And then I made the mistake of clicking on an article that really upset me and sat with me for days. And in my head, as I was clicking, I was like, "Don't do it," and I did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some level, I mean, trauma might be a large word, maybe a little T trauma, like baby
Mm-hmm.
trauma, of like I consumed something
Mm-hmm.
that didn't better my life in any way,
Right.
was not going to be implemented to keep me safe and healthy
Right.
or my family, and really got to the empathetic part of me to a point where I think I took on sadness that wasn't mine
Mm-hmm.
as though it were. Because when I read certain things, I feel it. And then I'm like, oh, and then I feel like that's me in that experience, even though it's not, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I can consume it to that level. And I was like, that was stupid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm very mindful. Certain news things don't bother me as much as others, right? But it's gauging what's your tolerance? And if things are impacting you to the point where it's making you overly fearful, right? Because there's also the reality of living in that state ongoing is not healthy for us either. If we're
Right.
constantly running at a, stressed, anxious level where it's constantly peaking, that's not great for our bodies, right? So I really look at what do I need to phase out
Mm-hmm.
to function in this world?
Yeah. I remember when we still lived in Atlanta, and I don't know what year. I remember sitting at a Mexican restaurant in the West Village in Smyrna, and it was whatever season of life when the biggest threat that we had at the time was ISIS. I don't know what year that was. I've lost that brain cell. That's fine. But I remember sitting there with my husband, and he was telling me some of these things, and I was like, okay, okay, I need you to stop. Like, I said, let's start a new thing. I need for you to only tell me things that I have to know.
Mhm.
I'm gonna I already said my husband's like really cool, calm, collected, cool cucumber, not driven by anxiousness at all. So I said, you be the filter for us because I am much more emotionally driven than he is, and much more physiologically reactive for sure to stressors. And so I'm like, you be the filter. Like, I don't want to hear it unless I need to do something. Like, if I need to like pack up my house and like move my family, that's when I need you to tell me.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like somebody's invading our country now, please. Like, we need to motivate. Otherwise, like, I don't really need to do anything about that, right? That's not going to affect my daily life,
Yeah.
right? Is that oblivious? Maybe, but I'm okay with that, right? Because to me, my responsibility in this world is to my physical health, my child, and second to those two things, my blessing in this world is to help other people. And the way that I do that is one or two at a time for 50 minutes a session, right? In my
Yeah.
office, right? I'm not a politician. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not an activist, right? I have a sister who is, and that's a beautiful thing. But like, that's not what I was uniquely gifted with. And so I need to keep my energy calm, my body as healthy as possible. And so minimizing the exposure to anything, whether it's news, conversations, even certain types of music, I can feel my body tensing in response to, or certain movies or TV shows or books. I've become very selective as I've gotten older. Like our family, we love to watch movies on a Sunday afternoon, whether it's a rainy Sunday or like in Florida, it's like sometimes it's 90 and full sun and you just can't do anything but go inside and be in the air conditioning mid-afternoon. And we always joke, like, is it about an inn in Italy where they're saving a vineyard and falling in love? Like, okay, well, mommy will let you watch that then, right? Because it's like a happy, feel good, it's always going to have a good ending. Like, I look for the taglines of movies that say like heartfelt, upbeat, and romantic. Like, yes, okay, please, let's give me that one, right? I want to consume things that make me feel happy and safe and secure and hopeful and peaceful and joyful and love and not fear. And I have a system in my husband. And like you said, we're constantly interfacing with people every day and we hear what our clients are scared by, right? So it gets filtered through of like, okay, well, God forbid there's something really awful happening. I know how to tune in when I need to tune in.
Yes.
Intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And I used to love like all these crime shows and Dateline and all these, since having kids, I can't watch them.
No.
Because it strikes me differently again, than it did before. I also wonder, and I sit with this a lot, I wonder if I wasn't a therapist holding other people's pain and trauma all the time and anxieties and all the rest of it, would I be able to tolerate more of the information that could potentially come to me? Probably, right? But there's like finite energy I have to manage the negative, so yeah, my choice is to not consume the news. I get sent a lot of things, texted to me, articles, whatever, that I just delete. I don't even read them. Sorry, friends who are sending me things. And I have to. I don't interact with certain people if their energy is causing me to kind of spiral, or there's intensity with certain conversations or topics. Like, I've just really gotten aware of kind of protecting my energy too, right? Protecting my energy so that I can deal with the anxiety that's just inherent, right? I've also found that in general, and I think this rings true for anxiety overall, is kind of taking a step back and really looking at this moment. Because anxiety is always like future based, right? It's what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this turns out to be that and it's terrible, right? But if you really look at like this exact moment, so my example of, anxiety about leaving the house in case we don't make it home from date night,
Right.
There was no evidence that was going to be a thing. That was just my brain going, what if, wonder. And so I was like, well, in this moment, like, I am safe and we're going to enjoy a dinner and I can't control any other outcome, whether I know about it or don't. Like, there's nothing I can do. And so the way I manage that is to just bring my brain back to this very second. And in this very second, we're having an enjoyable dinner, right? Or we're connecting, or yay, we have a babysitter. That's exciting, right? So like, and that's helpful for regardless of where your anxiety lies or what it kind of focuses around, right? This ability to say, my brain is signaling potential danger, but in this moment, that is a false anxiety, right? That danger is not existing. There is no actual threat in this moment.
Right.
There are times when there are, and your anxiety is useful, and that adrenaline rush and that fight or flight response is absolutely necessary, right? But in a
Yeah,
lot of times it's not. And I think it's distinguishing that for yourselves.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd even separate that out for my clients. I teach people that anxiety is always a story that your brain tells about something that may or may not happen in the future that isn't happening now. Like you said, it's not real yet. It may never become real. And that we're creating that story just like we could create any sort of a story should we be asked to do so.
Yes.
And that in the moment, if there's actually a threat happening, I teach people that to call that the threat response or a stress response, right? Because it's different, right? That is real, it's adaptive, it's survival, and it's not a story, it's not future oriented. And sometimes that feels helpful for people asking, like, okay, whoa, I just slammed on brakes because a car actually pulled out in front of me. That was a stress response. My body did exactly what it was supposed to do to keep me safe, right?
Yeah.
Versus laying awake at night and imagining what to do to get your baby if the smoke detector goes off, right?
Right.
Which, to your point, and maybe I know we have to wrap up, but maybe I think I heard one other thing that is important in what you and I both shared, which was staying present in the moment, eliminating unnecessary noise and stimuli that are it's gonna trigger anxiety. But also, you said something about, okay, I have to let this go, right? Because it's not helpful for me. And the part of how that wasn't helpful is because you had already done what you needed to do, right? Your children were with babysitters. You had a list of, emergency contact numbers, right? You probably have a will and blah, 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 right? So your ducks were in a row, right? If that anxiety had come and you were like, oh, okay, honey, we got to finalize that will, right? Or honey, we got to call grandma and let her know we're going to go to Chops tonight, right? So God forbid, the baby could call her, we weren't home by 1 a.m., right? To have plans in place to make sure we're safe. And then once that's done, right, then those worries and fears and stories are no longer helpful. And then that's when we have to know to drop it and to come back to the present moment and to try to turn that brain off.
Yeah. And I've also found not fighting it, right? Not shaming myself for having these thoughts, for just saying, okay, brain, like, thanks for the info, right? Thanks for the concern that you're concerned, and letting it, because I think when you try to avoid it, it gets louder, right? I ignore it, it nags. It's like, you will listen to me.
Right. Because we got to keep everybody safe.
Yeah, right. Like, and so, in that sense, I don't fight it. I let my brain come up with whatever crazy thought it comes up with, but I don't hold that thought, right? I consciously say, okay, thank you for the message. Back in this moment, that is not a concern, right? With what I know to be true right this second, that's not even something worth focusing on. Or yes, I've done the things that I need to prepare for that, so that's all I can do. And then I take a deep breath and I continue to focus on where I am in the moment, right? But I don't fight it, because there shouldn't be shame around that. Like, that's a really normal response. It's a human response to worry, to, preserve yourself and your family.
And hopefully, somebody listening will feel that way after hearing us talk about it, right? That yes, even therapists have anxiety, and anxiety is not just mental health diagnosis in the DSM. It's actually an adaptive response. It means our brains are working the exact way they're supposed to work. That's kept our species alive for thousands and thousands of years. And it's normal that I have more anxiety now that I'm a mom or sometimes a dad, right? Okay, good, right? I don't have to get rid of this. I don't have to shame myself or belittle myself or try to ignore it or avoid it. I can thank it, recognize it, assess whether it needs to stay or go, and then deal with it effectively. And we'll probably will be able to come back and talk in more depth about all of those aspects, right? As we keep chatting on future episodes of our podcast.
Absolutely. But yeah, I love that idea of just not, that accepting it as part of the experience. And it's not this like pathological response that we have, but it's super adaptive and,
Yeah.
Normalizing it because it's a thing that we all experience at some
I
point.
know.
I know.
So
Cool.
normal.
Well, yay. It was great chatting today about
I
this.
know, you too.
We will probably dive into anxiety again in the future, I'm sure, because it pops up a lot for, people and us and anyone kind of living life. It just kind of creeps up every now and then.
I feel like we dipped our toe in like so many different ponds that we could like dive into at any, future podcast. So maybe
Yes.
we'll have to figure out where we go next.
Yeah. So join us next week to see what pond we jump into then.
I like that. Good teaser.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.